The Apollo Moon Missions. Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. Part 2 by Randy Walsh.
To add to Parsons' despair of being ostracized by the scientific community, he was now being investigated by the FBI for allegedly having a connection to a communist party. With this investigation, the FBI would inevitably come across his occult background as well. To make matters worse, Parsons was also being investigated for the more serious offense of espionage. This was around the early 1950s when the country was in an era of paranoia over the fear of communist infiltration in government, the military-industrial complex, educational institutions, Hollywood, and just about any other facet of society as named by the House Committee of Un-American Activities. This led to Parsons' security clearance being revoked as he was a member of the scientific community that was under close scrutiny given the importance of their work, especially in the military-industrial complex. As a result of no security clearance, Parsons could no longer be employed in the aerospace industry. However, due to insufficient evidence of any espionage activity, Parsons' security clearance was renewed by the Industrial Employment Review Board, IERB. But that didn't last long as the IERB revoked his security clearance yet again, this time permanently. Due to his connections to the occult, which they used to judge his character, Parsons was no longer involved in the OTO, and now without a security clearance, he was no longer allowed to work within the military-industrial complex. In essence, Parsons' two worlds collided, which in a twist of fate would annihilate one another, as we shall soon see, Parsons along with them. His final act and demise. The early 1950s was an era of change for Parsons. He had taken on other projects, for example, working in the film industry as a special effects expert on explosives. It was on this very day that he and Cameron had planned for leaving for their trip that he received a call from the Special Effects Corporation for a quick project that they needed done before he left. In fact, he had been storing a highly volatile chemical in their warehouse at the time since he was on contract with them. But because someone had rented some space from the Special Effects Corporation, Parsons was forced to move his highly volatile chemicals and stored them in the laundry room of his house. Parsons had agreed to the Special Effects Corporation's request. It was around 5 p.m. when Parsons was alone mixing various chemicals for their project when the house shook from an explosion. When the people rushed to Parsons' makeshift laboratory, he was found seriously injured but conscious. His injuries included multiple fractures and several burns. He lingered on in obvious shock for an estimated 37 minutes. Jack Whiteside Parsons died at Huntington Memorial Hospital at the young age of 37. After hearing of her son's death, Ruth Parsons had gotten a prescription for Nembutal to help her cope with her understandable and obvious grief. However, in a moment of intense grief, Ruth Parsons, who is alleged to have overdosed at the young age of 61, joined her son hours after hearing the tragic news. There had been speculation over the years as to what led to the explosion that killed Jack Parsons. Some say that Parsons was careless and sloppy with his work, but that seems out of character for a man who was meticulous and organized about the work he did. Others say that there was something more nefarious going on, which is intriguing given his background both personally and professionally. The more likely scenario is it was an unfortunate accident, although we will most likely never know for sure. Parsons' legacy. It's obvious to anyone with a special background knowledge of Jack Parsons why NASA is reluctant to discuss this man, although even they cannot deny his proven methods, which, as mentioned above, were included in the launch of the space shuttle. Further, his place in history has in part been solidified by others including JPL. In an open house to the public once a year, JPL recreates a scene that depicts its founders Rudolph Schott, Amos Smith, Frank Molina, Ed Foreman, and Jack Parsons relaxing after their first test of a liquid-fueled rocket on October 31, 1936, which is the very day of JPL's foundation. Halloween Day seems a fitting choice to officially start a company by a self-taught scientist who had as much passion for the occult as he did for rockets. And it was the International Aeronautical Union in France, not NASA, who honored Parsons in 1972 by naming a lunar crater after him called Parsons Crater. The crater is appropriately located on the dark side of the Moon. Parsons and Foreman are a great example of how insightful people can be even when they lack an academic background, but nonetheless inspire academics like Molina and others to form working relationships that can lead to inventions of new technologies and methods. But as we will learn in this video series, this was but one step in technology on a road to discovery for future generations to build on in expanding an industry that should have flourished regardless of the cost. Instead, this has led to a roadblock in the aerospace industry that has been felt for decades and will most likely continue for decades more. An industry that has not progressed much further in technologies in terms of its rocket propulsion systems since the early 20th century for military and commercial use. It is akin to the aviation industry going no further than a single-pilot, propeller-driven aircraft. As with the unmanned and manned space programs, the continuous use of early 20th century propulsion systems are still in use. For example, Russia, which at least has managed to maintain a consistent capability of launching manned missions to low Earth orbit. The claim of limited funding is often used as an excuse by proponents for the lack of progress in the space program. However, all anyone has to do is follow NASA's funding to see the billions of dollars that could have been easily proprietized for its manned space program. Yet, from 2011 on, NASA has spent billions of dollars funding unmanned missions and maintaining the International Space Station while they neglect their own means of getting the astronauts to it, relying instead on the Russian manned space program to do it for them. Given NASA's claims of superiority in the manned space program, one would expect that they would have had a workable manned spacecraft ready for launch after the space shuttle was retired. Jack Parsons' theories and work is credited with those propulsion systems still in use, a first step that has now been forever assigned its proper place in history, regardless of the fact that today NASA has not been able to build on this technology. This is apparent not only with its decision to fake the Apollo moon missions, but for the fact that for 30 years their manned space program, i.e. the Space Shuttle, went no further than LEO. Yet from 1961 to 1969, NASA claims to have designed and engineered spacecraft and accomplished 6 manned lunar landings. In the same time period, from 2011, NASA managed to launch only 1 manned mission to the ISS with the SpaceX Falcon 9 and Dragon spacecraft on November 15, 2020. A counter-argument to this is that previous to NASA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, founded in 1915 leading up to NASA, which was established in 1958, had actually been gathering data that was then incorporated into the relatively new aerospace industry and, of course, for the Apollo moon mission program. So, the proponents say NASA has decades of data to access, so the timeline of 80 years to land men on the moon is misleading. However, the goal of the NACA was to collect data for the aeronautical industry that already existed for an environment that mankind was more than familiar with. The manned space program required data for an environment never experienced by mankind, so, in essence, NASA had little or no data for the hostile environment in which they planned on sending manned missions through. Therefore, the real timeline was closer to 8 years for which they needed to collect data for a hostile environment to design and engineer spacecraft capable of sending manned missions to LEO, landing and liftoff from the lunar surface, traveling back to the Earth, and for re-entry and splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. NASA has never been able to duplicate its own claim of technological prowess in such a short timeline since. As for writing about Parsons' world of the occult, The point is to once and for all break the myth that somehow scientists are immune to some of the influences of our respective societies, when in actuality they are subject to the same desires, competitiveness, spiritual beliefs, dislikes, likes, jealous egos, and many of the other human traits that make us who we are. And in the aerospace industry, these traits are more common than most people know, Parsons being but one example. This, along with Parsons' deep involvement in the occult, is the foundation in which JPL was formed, which leads a straight path to NASA. An intriguing connection. Although this has been reported in other sources, I gained more insight from my research into Parsons and Foreman's numerous contacts with Wernher von Braun before World War II. Pendle quotes from Ed Foreman's third wife. Both of the boys had talked to von Braun many times by telephone way before he ever came to the U.S. They were crazy about von Braun and he was crazy about them because they were out horsing around with the same stuff. Parsons' contact with Wernher von Braun before and possibly even during World War II makes one wonder what else had been left out of the history books regarding von Braun and many other contacts that he had with American officials before he surrendered to American military forces in 1945. This raises serious questions as to how the FBI either missed the correspondence with a known Nazi before and possibly during World War II, or they knew about it and for some reason they weren't overly concerned. Further, it is now rumored that Parsons may have even met von Braun after he was brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Parsons' ongoing contact with von Braun before and possibly during World War II is yet another one of those coincidences that we've seen with Parsons in both his World by Day and his World by Night. And although Parsons' contact with von Braun may have appeared to have been innocent, it's a stretch to believe that American intelligence agencies didn't know about this. A more likely scenario is that American intelligences did know and were collecting intel, possibly, through others along with Parsons. This more than indicates that Parsons was in some capacity an intelligence agent. Either way, it seems that von Braun had at least indirect connections to American intelligence agencies before and during World War II, which have not yet been fully disclosed. However, one undeniable fact is clear. Jack Whiteside Parsons' legacy in the aerospace industry has now secured its proper place in history. It is obvious that NASA and people in general are reserved in their recognition and praise of such a controversial man like Jack Parsons. He was a mystery and an insightful man, not bound by a set of rules that were forced on scientists by academia, and he refused to allow the academic community to influence him in any way. When there was a problem which no one could solve, Parsons stepped out of the established norms and solved the problem with an insight that very few scientists had. In a sense, he then rewrote the rules and then told the academic community to make their equations fit those of the rules as he saw it, with his brilliant insight that solved the problems of combustion instabilities with solid rocket fuel boosters. Aside from Jack Parsons' belief in the occult, other scientists obviously have and had a belief in something more esoteric, including institution, than what established controversial science is willing to admit even exists. After the Apollo 1 tragedy, NASA engineers and scientists were clearly spooked to the point of demanding an unmanned mission for the first Saturn 1B launch with Apollo 5. Charles R. Pellegrino and Joshua Stoff wrote, "No crew? Well, of course no crew. That was clearly understood through unspoken law. No men were to fly in the Saturn 1B 204. Ever. This was not to say that NASA was acknowledging a belief in ghosts or spirits or anything else supernatural, but the space organization did believe that there was something basically wrong about sending a crew up in a rocket with so many bad memories attached to it. and there was something else, probably nothing more than a trick of the imagination, still, if you touched the vehicle, those memories, a touch would bring them out. Get us out! Bubbling up out of the subconscious. As we've seen in part 1 of this video series, logic is not exactly emblematic of NASA's overall philosophy when it comes to their manned space program. The absence of proper and rigorous flight testing standards needed to certify spacecraft for human travel has been well documented. Yet here we see NASA adopt a far more esoteric reason for unmanned flight testing for Apollo 5, contrary to the established laws of logic and common sense, as is prevalent in the scientific community. This is an intriguing area with many examples that needs to be taken more seriously by the scientific community. Maybe if they allow themselves to explore more esoteric themes, it will bring enlightenment in ways no equations can bring on their own. Here are some good examples of scientists who will allow esoteric beliefs and institutions to rule. Pellegrino and Joshua Wright. No, scientists really don't believe in these things, not really. Then again, on a one-to-one basis, very rarely and in secret, some will admit to the possibility of a whole new science yet to be explored, and they dare not risk their reputations and their careers to explore it. We know of a paleontologist who can pick up a rock and tell you where that rock has been. Suddenly, the desert that we are standing in no longer is a desert but a forest that grew here 100 years ago. He holds up the rock, a time gate, and looks ahead through the trees. Come, he says, follow me. I will show you where the lake was, where the stream deposited the amber, and, oh, Charlie, there's something else near the stream. A tyrannosaur died there. We walk, we dig, we find the lake and the amber. The expedition that arrives after us finds the tyrannosaur. We know of the geneticist who, like a paleontologist, explores nature through what? Supernature? When I was really working with chromosomes, I wasn't outside the microscope. I was right down there with the team and everything got big. I saw things that nobody else did. I was even able to see the internal parts of the chromosomes. Actually, everything was there. It surprised me because I actually felt as if I were right there and those were my friends. And this approach to discovery, laughably as it may seem, led Barbara McClintock to a Nobel Prize. We know of a rocket that had no crew. Replace paleontologist and geneticist with a rocket scientist in the above quote, and you have Jack Parsons. This is the best analysis of how Parsons was able to see such details without any formal education, unlike his highly educated colleagues. This may also explain Parsons' fascination with the occult, given that he saw more and experienced more than most people. Like the paleontologist and the geneticist, Parsons became one with his work, a gift that can never be learned in a classroom. However, we must give credit to his colleagues who worked with him and had the wisdom and foresight to follow Parsons even though they didn't fully understand his methods. A cooperation among professionals who, unlike most of their contemporaries, cared more for finding real answers while refusing to allow their egos and their competitive nature to rule the day. Unfortunately, scientists like Jack Parsons and his colleagues are lacking in today's academic institutions. Scientists, for the most part, are no longer allowed independent thought or research. Their research has become influenced by government and corporate funding. Corporations use their power to influence science, which in turn is then used to influence people. This is usually done with corporations and the corporate-controlled scientific community lobbying governments to pass legislation forcing people into submission in so many facets of our society. Science has also taken on a whole new meaning, and it is not so much about the serious research anymore. It is research that is so often influenced by corporations and politics with profits and power as its real goal. The new unwritten policy is, questions and concerns will no longer be tolerated by the general public. However, there are some scientists who do pursue research for the betterment of mankind. I know of a few who refuse to be dictated by fiduciary obligations. Their only goal is to go wherever their research leads them. These are very dedicated individuals whose work is free of any outside influence that usually has an agenda, so they are free to pursue real science first. As for the manned space program today, NASA could definitely benefit from the likes of Jack Parsons, who take propulsion systems to the next level. Parsons knew the limitations of the propulsion systems used today, which is probably why he sold his shares in JPL. This is supported by NASA's inability to send manned missions beyond LEO using this technology, and it doesn't seem they'll do so in the foreseeable future. The next part of this series will now show the limitations of this technology, which is the real reason why there hasn't been a manned mission beyond LEO, at least with technology that the public is aware of. Part 1 of this series described and analyzed the Apollo 11 missions that supposedly journeyed to the moon and back. It described how 1960s technology would have been inadequate for a manned moon mission, for example, the inability of the F-1 engines of the Saturn V to use their full power capacity because of combustion chamber instabilities, and without the F-1 engines in the first stage of the Saturn V working at full power capacity, Apollo 11 could not have reached its optimum altitude 2 minutes after launch, where the first stage would have been jettisoned. After the jettisoning of the first stage, and regardless of the fact that the Saturn V's J2 engines in the second stage apparently ignited and worked perfectly, Apollo 11 was still lower in altitude 2 minutes after the launch. This means that Apollo 11 could not have reached optimum orbit necessary for its eventual translunar insertion, no matter how perfectly the J2 engines functioned. If a contingency was worked out to have the J2 engines burn longer to compensate for a lower than planned altitude after launch, then more propellant would have been needed. But because of weight restrictions, propellant was limited to what was originally planned for in terms of the Saturn V's trajectory on launch. This would have prevented any contingency for a further burn during the J2 engines in the Saturn V. Further, since the F-1 engines were not capable of using their full power capacity, or they weren't even used at all, Apollo 11 and subsequent Apollo missions could not have launched the necessary payloads into LEO necessary for manned lunar landings. We also described in the first part of this video series the impossibility of a mission like Apollo 11 to have safely traveled through the Van Allen belts due to intense radiation, as well as the other hazardous elements like solar particle events, galactic cosmic rays, the problem of thermal control, and micrometeoroid impacts. As has been established, any one of these elements would have ended the Apollo mission. However, the more aspects of the Apollo missions that are analyzed, and by inference that includes all of the Apollo missions, the more we counter NASA's claims that 6 of these missions landed safely on the lunar surface. In the 1960s, NASA had to choose between competing companies who would bid on contracts to design and engineer manned and unmanned spacecraft for the pre-Apollo missions. Specifically, the unmanned missions including taking detailed photos of the lunar surface to help NASA decide which landing sites to choose from, as well as a soft landing unmanned spacecraft on the lunar surface. But first, we will look at the first 2 manned space programs that were used to collect data, as well as the practicing of techniques in low Earth orbit, specifically rendezvous, dockings, and manual versus automatic maneuvers. Further, we will determine the failures and the success of the pre-Apollo missions. We will then use this information to make an estimate of the chances for success with the Apollo moon missions had they really taken place. NASA itself would have done this, but we'll use an arbitrary method to arrive at our own estimation based on existing technologies for that era, while giving NASA the benefit of the doubt. In the last section, I mentioned NASA had 2 manned space programs leading up to the Apollo missions, but some say that there were actually 3 manned space programs leading up to the Apollo missions, so it's worth clarifying the discrepancies as to the number of manned space programs during the early 1960s. Since the United States defines the boundary of space as being over 50 miles, the first American to have technically reached space was Air Force test pilot Robert Michael White when he reached an altitude of 59.6 miles in the X-15, which was a rocket-powered aircraft. However, the internationally accepted boundary of space is the Kármán line at 62 miles, which means White is only recognized as the first American astronaut within the United States. Since the X-15 reached just about the boundary layer of space, which means the pilots would have experienced weightlessness, then technically it is considered one of the 3 manned space missions programs whose objectives were to collect data for future manned space missions. But the international community only recognizes Project Mercury and Project Gemini as the first 2 manned space missions. This is what has caused the discrepancy in the manned space missions. We will not include the X-15 as a manned space program since this was a rocket-powered aircraft and not a spacecraft. So, when referring specifically to the pre-Apollo manned missions, we will only involve the Mercury and Gemini missions. But it is worth mentioning that the X-15 program for its contribution to the data it collected for the overall space program, which is still being evaluated decades later. The X-15 program. The X-15 flew between 1959 to 1968. It was launched from under the wing of a B-52 at 45,000 feet, which then fired its rocket engine and flew to an altitude of over 50 miles, the boundary layer of space. Each mission would last approximately 10 minutes and then land at Edwards Air Force Base. The main purpose of these missions was to gain data on re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere for the American space program. Re-entry procedures will be discussed in detail a little bit further in this video series. However, another aspect gained from the X-15 program and its most enduring legacy was the importance of designing more sophisticated simulators capable of duplicating flight conditions for the aviation and aerospace industries. This too would greatly enhance training for both pilots and astronauts. This also started the debate regarding manual versus automation, which we will also learn was an ongoing debate within the manned space program. The X-15 made a substantial contribution to the re-entry procedures. This involved corrective control during re-entry using a vehicle with the aerodynamic design of an aircraft. However, NASA had decided on a capsule concept for its manned space missions in the 1960s, so we will focus instead on that concept and design later on in this video series when re-entering into Earth's atmosphere, which has little or no corrective control abilities. Project Mercury. There were 6 manned missions for Project Mercury from 1961 to 1963. These were 1 manned spacecraft, which were the first American spacecraft to reach LEO. These missions had an apogee of no more than 176 miles and a perigee of 100 miles. The goal of the Mercury program was straightforward. 1. To send astronauts into LEO, and 2. Practice re-entry into Earth's atmosphere and eventual splashdown in the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. Therefore, the Mercury program had met its objectives. However, the issue of manned versus automation was brought to the forefront of the discussions, which had caused a fierce debate among many of the astronauts who objected to just being passengers in Mercury spacecraft. Author David A. Mindel writes, as John Glenn told a press conference soon after his selection to the Mercury team, "We don't want to just sit there and be just like a passenger aboard this thing. We will be working the controls." Nevertheless, the automatic versus primary approach would survive through the Apollo missions. It is interesting to note that Buzz Aldrin had been heard to repeat a similar theme when he was questioned decades later about the validity of the Apollo missions, saying that they were just passengers. although given what we know today, this definitely has more than one meaning.
The Apollo Moon Missions. Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. Part 2 by Randy Walsh.